There is a moment in the last book of the Bible when an angel who had just poured out one of the 7 final bowls of judgment turns to the Apostle John and says something strange, almost like an invitation into forbidden territory. "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters." And with that single sentence, the reader is pulled out of the courtroom of heaven and into a wilderness vision unlike anything else in Scripture. A vision so layered in symbol and mystery that entire centuries of believers have argued over what they were truly seeing. And yet the text itself insists on calling it exactly that, a mystery written across the forehead of the woman herself. And this is where our story begins, not with an explanation, but with a scene. John carried away in the Spirit into a desert place, and there before him a woman seated upon a scarlet-colored beast, a creature full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and the woman herself arrayed in purple and scarlet, decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup, beautiful beyond description. And yet that golden cup is full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead a name is written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And John says he saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when he saw her, he wondered with great admiration, not admiration in the sense of approval, but astonishment, a kind of stunned horror at how such beauty could conceal such bloodshed. And this tension between glamour and grief is the very heart of what this vision is trying to teach. Because Babylon in Revelation is never once described as ugly. She is never a monster in the way the beast beneath her is a monster. She is gorgeous. She is bejeweled. She is the picture of everything the world calls success. And that is precisely what makes her dangerous. For evil that announces itself with claws and fire is easy to flee. But evil that arrives wearing purple and gold, offering a cup that looks like wine and tastes like power, is the kind that empties a soul slowly while it still believes itself to be thriving. The angel does not leave John or us without explanation. He tells him the beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition, language that echoes and inverts the divine name itself, the one who was and is to come, as though this beast is a dark parody of eternity, a counterfeit permanence that will ultimately prove hollow. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and they are also 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. And the 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but receive power as kings for 1 single hour with the beast. And here the vision turns and does something unexpected. These very kings who were her lovers and her allies will one day hate the whore, and make her desolate and naked, and eat her flesh, and burn her utterly with fire, because God has put it in their hearts to fulfill His will, and to agree and give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled, meaning that Babylon is not destroyed by outside righteous judgment alone, but consumed by the very forces she once seduced. Her own allies become her executioners, greed devouring greed, power turning finally on power. And the woman herself, the angel says plainly, is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth, and with that identification, the vision moves forward into its next and most devastating movement. Chapter 18 opens with another angel coming down from heaven, having great power, and the earth is lightened with his glory, and he cries mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And then comes one of the most curious passages in all of prophetic literature, a long and detailed cargo list, as though the Spirit wants us to feel the sheer weight and texture of what this civilization traded in. gold and silver and precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet, all manner of vessels of ivory and vessels of most precious wood, and of brass and iron and marble, cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense, wine and oil and fine flour and wheat, and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots. And the list ends on a chilling final item: slaves, and the souls of men, tucked in among the fine linen and the marble, as though human beings themselves had become just one more commodity on the manifest. And this detail alone reveals what the deepest sickness of Babylon actually is. It is a system so thoroughly organized around profit that even people become products. Even souls become cargo. And once that line is crossed, everything else, however beautiful, is built on a foundation already rotten. The merchants who grew rich from her weep and mourn over her, for no man buys their merchandise anymore. And the shipmasters and sailors, and all the company in ships, stand far off and cry when they see the smoke of her burning, saying, "What city is like unto this great city?" And they cast dust on their heads, and weep and wail, saying, "Alas, alas, that great city, wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea by reason of her costliness. For in 1 hour is she made desolate." And this refrain, in 1 hour, tolls through the chapter like a bell. In 1 hour so great riches is come to nothing. In 1 hour is thy judgment come, a civilization that took generations to build, that spanned oceans and stretched across continents in trade routes and treasuries and monuments, collapses within a single, unbearable hour. And the abruptness of that collapse is itself part of the message, that everything built on the wrong foundation, no matter how vast it appears, is closer to ruin than anyone standing inside it can imagine. And yet, even as the merchants and kings and sailors weep on earth, heaven is told to do the opposite. "Rejoice over her, thou heaven, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her." The same event produces mourning below and rejoicing above, because what looks like loss from inside the system of Babylon is recognized from the vantage point of eternity as long overdue justice. Then a mighty angel takes up a stone like a great millstone and casts it into the sea, saying, "Thus with violence shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. And the voice of harpers and musicians and pipers and trumpeters shall be heard no more at all in thee. And no craftsman of whatsoever craft shall be found any more in thee. And the sound of a millstone shall be heard no more at all in thee. And the light of a candle shall shine no more at all in thee. And the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth. For by thy sorceries were all nations deceived, and in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all that were slain upon the earth." And it is worth pausing here on that final accusation: sorcery, deception. For whatever else Babylon is, whatever city or system or empire the ancient hearers might have recognized in this portrait, the text insists that her core weapon was never brute force alone, but seduction, enchantment, a spell cast through luxury and spectacle so convincing that entire nations mistook slavery for prosperity. And to understand why the Spirit chose the name Babylon for this final embodiment of worldly rebellion, it helps to travel all the way back to the beginning of the story, long before Nebuchadnezzar and his golden image, long before Belshazzar's feast and the mysterious hand that wrote judgment on a palace wall, back to a plain in the land of Shinar where the descendants of Noah said, "Let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And that city was called Babel. And it was there, at the very root of human civilization after the flood, that the pattern first appears. People gathering their strength, not to worship the Creator, but to make a name for themselves, to reach upward by their own effort and their own bricks. And God came down and confused their language and scattered them. And so it is no accident that the word Babylon carries, buried inside it, the very memory of Babel, of humanity organizing itself in glorious defiance of heaven, and every empire that ever rose afterward in pride and splendor, while crushing the humble underfoot, has, in some sense, been building on that same plane, wearing that same ambition. Historical Babylon itself, the literal empire on the Euphrates, gave the world hanging gardens and towering walls, and a king named Nebuchadnezzar, who built an image of gold and commanded the world to bow before it on pain of death, and threw 3 faithful young men into a fiery furnace for refusing, and later a king named Belshazzar, who drank wine from the sacred vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem, while praising gods of gold and silver, only to watch a hand appear and write 4 words on the wall, numbered, weighed, divided. That very same night the kingdom fell, and it is impossible to read the vision of Revelation without hearing echoes of that older Babylon rattling through it. But the vision is not merely retelling ancient history, it is naming something that recurs, again and again in every generation, wherever wealth is gathered through the exploitation of the vulnerable, wherever splendor is used to mask violence, wherever a system convinces the world that its cup of luxury is worth drinking. Even though the cup itself is filled with abomination, there Babylon rises again, robed in whatever fashions and technologies and currencies happen to be in style at that particular hour of history. This is why prophets long before John used similar imagery for other proud powers. Ezekiel wept over Tyre, a city whose merchants had made her exceeding beautiful in the midst of the seas, whose heart became lifted up because of her riches. And the prophet warned that all that beauty would be brought down to the pit. Isaiah spoke to Egypt and Assyria and Babylon herself in her earlier form, calling out empires that trusted in chariots and treasuries rather than in the living God. The pattern is consistent across the whole of Scripture. Wealth and beauty are never condemned in themselves, but wealth and beauty, severed from justice and humility, become a kind of intoxicant. A wine that makes whole nations drunk until they can no longer tell right from wrong. And this is exactly the language Revelation uses. The wine of the wrath of her fornication, a phrase that suggests Babylon does not merely tempt individuals one at a time, but actually alters the perception of entire civilizations, so that cruelty starts to look normal and greed starts to look like virtue. And it is against this backdrop that Revelation places a second woman, deliberately, as a mirror and a rebuke to the first. For later in the same book, after Babylon has fallen and the harpers have gone silent, John sees another city descending, not built by human hands, reaching upward in pride, but coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And where Babylon's beauty was purchased through blood and cargo and sorcery, this city's beauty comes as a gift, unearned, freely given. And the contrast could not be sharper. 2 women, 2 cities, 2 economies, one built on extraction and one built on grace, one whose citizens grow rich by making others poor, and one whose gates never even need to be shut because there is no more fear inside them. This is perhaps the deepest lesson hidden inside the strange and violent imagery of Mystery Babylon, that the real conflict running through the whole of the Bible, from Babel to Babylon to the final chapters of Revelation, has never simply been good people against bad people, but 2 competing visions of what a city, a civilization, a life is actually for, whether it exists to make a name for itself or to reflect the glory of the one who made it. Whether it clothes people in false purple bought at the price of their neighbor's blood, or clothes them, instead, in the righteousness that is given rather than earned, students of prophecy have long debated exactly which historical or future power the vision points to most directly. Some early readers, living under Roman persecution, recognized their own empire in the description almost immediately. A city famously built on 7 hills, draped in purple and scarlet, growing wealthy on trade routes stretching across the known world, and guilty of shedding the blood of the very apostles and prophets the text mentions. Others across history have applied the image to later empires and systems that rose in similar splendor and similarly persecuted the faithful. And still others read Babylon less as a single nation and more as a description of any global economic and religious order, present in every era in some form, that fuses commerce and idolatry so completely that buying and selling itself becomes an act of worship directed at something other than God. The text itself seems to resist a single, tidy identification, calling itself mystery. And perhaps that resistance is intentional, so that every generation of readers is forced to ask the same uncomfortable question of its own moment in history. Where is Babylon operating now? Not out there in some distant empire alone, but here, in the systems I benefit from. In the cup I'm drinking from without noticing its contents. And this is why, in the middle of the judgment scene, before the smoke has even finished rising, a different voice cries out from heaven, "Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities." And this command is not primarily geographic. It does not simply mean flee a city or abandon a country. It is an invitation to an inward exodus, a call to examine one's own habits of consumption, one's own tolerance for cruelty when it comes wrapped in convenience, one's own willingness to drink from a golden cup without asking what filled it. The tragedy Revelation portrays is not that Babylon eventually falls. Every empire eventually falls. The tragedy is how many people spent their lives believing that her wine was the only wine worth drinking, that her marketplace was the only marketplace worth trading in, right up until the hour her music stopped, and her lights went dark, and her millstone grinding ceased forever. And the promise offered instead is not poverty or isolation, but a different kind of abundance altogether. A wedding rather than a funeral, a city whose foundations are jewels. Not because they were stolen from conquered nations, but because they reflect the very glory of God Himself. So that when the vision finally closes, and the reader looks back over these 2 chapters of splendor and smoke, merchants weeping and angels rejoicing, ancient Babel and final Babylon, the harlot's golden cup and the bride's wedding garment, what remains is not simply a warning about the distant future, but a mirror held up to every single day of ordinary life, asking quietly and insistently which city each heart is truly building toward, which love it is ultimately loyal to, and which voice it will choose to listen for. The cry of the merchants mourning what was lost, or the far older and far quieter invitation, "Come out of her, my people, and come home." But before that final invitation is reached, there is still more buried inside this vision worth walking through slowly, because the word John uses for what is written on the woman's forehead is not simply a title, but the Greek word mysterion, mystery, a term used elsewhere in the New Testament, not for something meant to remain forever hidden, but for something once concealed that has now been unveiled to those who have eyes to see. And this choice of words suggests that Babylon has always been operating in plain sight throughout history, hiding not in shadow, but in splendor, disguised not as darkness, but as light. And that the unveiling John receives in the wilderness is really an invitation for every reader afterward to recognize a pattern that was there all along in the story of nations. And this pattern shows up again and again under different names long before the word Babylon became attached to it in its final form. The prophet Nahum looked at the city of Nineveh, capital of Assyria, and called her a harlot too, well-favored, mistress of witchcrafts, that selleth nations through her whoredoms and families, through her witchcrafts, using almost identical language centuries before Revelation was written. And the prophets who wrote of Sodom did not describe her downfall as merely a matter of scandalous behavior in the streets, but named her deeper sin as pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, so that even that infamous city is remembered in Scripture less for a single night of disgrace, and more for a whole culture of comfort that had grown numb to the suffering of others. And when these threads are drawn together, Nineveh, Sodom, Tyre, ancient Babylon, and finally Mystery Babylon, At the very end of the story, a single continuous portrait begins to emerge of civilizations that mistake their own wealth for evidence of their own righteousness, that grow so accustomed to luxury that cruelty becomes invisible to them, hidden in plain view behind fine linen and marble columns and the pleasant hum of commerce. And it is worth noticing, too, the detail of the golden cup itself, because throughout the rest of Scripture, a cup is one of the most sacred images available, the cup of blessing that the psalmist says runs over. The cup Jesus lifts at the final meal with his disciples and calls the new covenant in his blood. And here in Revelation, that same image is deliberately inverted. A golden cup, beautiful to look at, offered by a beautiful hand, and yet filled with abominations, as though the entire vision is warning that the deepest danger a soul can face is not a cup that looks poisonous, but one that looks exactly like the cup of blessing while carrying something else inside it entirely. A false communion, a false covenant, offered by a false bride to nations who cannot tell the difference until it is far too late. And this is also why the beast beneath the woman matters so much to the picture, because a woman alone, however beautiful, has no power to conquer kings or command armies. She requires a structure to carry her, a system of thrones and horns and mountains. And this is precisely how corruption tends to spread through history. Not through one glamorous individual acting alone, but through beauty and seduction, riding on top of political and economic power that is willing to carry her weight in exchange for a share of her wine. Which is why the vision insists the very kings who once served as her transportation eventually turn on her and strip her bare. Because a system built purely on mutual exploitation always eventually consumes even its own architects. No alliance of greed is ultimately loyal to anyone. And the shipmasters weeping in chapter 18 deserve one more look as well, because their grief is oddly specific. They do not mourn the death of the woman herself so much as the loss of her market. No man buys their merchandise anymore, meaning that an entire economic ecosystem, built across oceans and generations, collapses the very moment its center of gravity disappears, a picture strikingly relevant to any age where global trade routes, communication networks, and entertainment industries interlock so tightly that the fall of one central hub can silence music and craftsmanship across an entire world in what feels like a single hour. And this is perhaps where the ancient vision speaks most directly into the modern moment, because every generation tends to assume Babylon must look like the empire just before its own eyes, a physical throne room, a literal palace, when in truth, Babylon may just as easily appear as a marketplace with no walls at all, a network of screens and transactions and entertainments so pleasant and so constant that few even notice they are drinking from her cup daily. And this is exactly why the silencing of music in the prophecy carries such weight. The voice of harpers and pipers and trumpeters shall be heard no more at all in thee, an eerie reversal of the joyful noise that fills the psalms and the songs of Zion, as though the very same appetite for beauty and celebration that God designed into human beings for worship has, in Babylon, been rerouted entirely into entertainment, divorced from any higher purpose, until the music itself becomes hollow. And when the hollowness is finally exposed, the silence that follows feels less like punishment and more like simple honesty. The noise finally stopping because there was nothing underneath it holding it up. And this same reversal appears again in the image of the millstone cast into the sea. An image that cannot help but recall words spoken by Jesus himself in the Gospels, that it would be better for a person to have a millstone hung around their neck and be cast into the sea than to cause one of these little ones to stumble, so that when the mighty angel throws an actual millstone into the actual sea in Revelation, the reader is meant to feel the weight of that earlier warning returning at last with full force. A civilization that caused nations to stumble through her sorceries and made merchandise of human souls receives in the end the very penalty her own crimes deserved. Poetic justice written into the physical symbol itself. And all of this, the cup, the beast, the silenced harps, the sinking stone, points finally back toward the same quiet command whispered from heaven in the middle of the chaos. Come out of her, my people. A command that asks each listener not to search the horizon for some distant enemy empire, but to examine their own daily rhythms, their own golden cups, their own quiet participation in systems that profit from suffering as long as that suffering stays comfortably out of view. And the beauty of the ending of this vision is that it does not leave anyone stranded in the ashes of what has fallen, because immediately following the smoke of Babylon's judgment, heaven begins preparing for a wedding. The marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife has made herself ready, and she is granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, and it is worth noticing that this second woman is given a garment that looks almost like the first, fine linen, brightness, glory. Except this time, the text specifies exactly what the fabric represents. For the fine linen is the righteousness of saints, meaning that the very beauty Babylon stole and counterfeited through violence and commerce is here restored to its rightful owner, freely given rather than seized, so that the entire sweeping vision, from the desert, where John first stood beside the angel, to the final descending city coming down like a bride adorned for her husband, becomes not simply a prophecy of doom, but a long, slow unveiling of the difference between two kinds of beauty, one purchased at the cost of other people's blood, and one given as a gift that costs the receiver nothing because it already cost everything on a hill outside an earlier and smaller Jerusalem. Come out of her, my people, and come home.